Hey there and welcome back to NBA 2K17. My name is Pete and today we complete the first year of NBA 2K17's MyGM or MyLeague mode with the New Orleans Pelicans. Now this is going to be a long one, there is a lot to do in New Orleans, but before we get into it there is one thing I want to mention first, and that's the Pelicans situation, which varies a bit depending on the roster you play with. If you're using the latest roster, then you have an entire season of Anthony Davis and Demarcus Cousins ahead of you before the 2017 offseason starts. That should put the Pelicans in a much better situation compared to their real-life counterparts who still struggled for the remainder of the season after the Cousins trade was made. If you are using the Day 1 roster or any other version from before the trade deadline, then you won't have Cousins on your team, but your priorities should not change that much. It is of critical importance for New Orleans to surround their generational superstar Anthony Davis with some star power. With the arrival of Demarcus Cousins, the Pelicans have taken a great first step and we will continue where they left off and hopefully improve the team even further. But before we dive into the moves to make in New Orleans, let's first have a look at their lineup. The Pelicans are in dire need of some solid players. Next to Cousins and Davis, the only other player to rely on is Jrue Holiday, and even he has a player rating below 80. The rest of the team consists of second-string role players who won't be much help. But let's go through the rotation position by position. Your clear-cut starter at the point guard will be Jrue Holiday, backed up by Tim Frazier. Holiday is good enough as the starting option for now, but he is on an expiring deal. Frazier had his ups and downs and his rating jumped accordingly during the season. For now though, he sits at a 72, which is probably just barely good enough for him to keep his role as the backup point guard. 23-year-old Quinn Cook has some upside, especially when it comes to shooting, but he's not at the point yet where he can truly contribute. The shooting guard features two more very solid shooters in Jordan Crawford and E'Twaun Moore. For now, Crawford has the slight edge rating-wise, but Moore isn't far behind and also a year younger. With Axel Tupal, the situation is similar to Quinn Cook. He will likely not surpass the two guys in front of him in the rotation anytime soon. The small forward position doesn't look too different from the shooting guard. With Pondexter, Cunningham and Hill, you have three guys here who could all start, but are all probably better off the bench. One of them will have to get the starting job of course, but feel free to rotate liberally here. The power forward and center spots are where the Pelicans shine. The duo of Davis and Cousins is a powerhouse and probably the best frontcourt in the league, at least in 2K. The backups are a bit lackluster though. Donatas Montejunas at the power forward is a solid inside scorer on an expiring deal, while the center position holds a total of 3 backup possibilities. Asik, Jinsa and Diallo are all close to each other rating-wise and their skill sets are very similar as well. All of them are pretty good rebounders, and even though Diallo has the worst rating, he has the age on his side. Only 20 years young, he could develop into a good rotation piece, and if you want to keep him on board, it also might make sense to switch him to power forward where his rating gets a slight boost, and also at 6'9" he might be a bit undersized for the center. Now when we look at the expiring contracts, one thing should jump at us immediately, and that is the fact that our third best player in Jrue Holiday will become a free agent next summer. While Crawford, Montejunas, Cook and Tupal also expired and cannot be extended, the potential departure of Holiday might cut a hole in the Pelicans rotation, and they already have enough of those. Bringing him or a comparable player back should therefore be one of your main goals for the first season. The Pelicans then only have one single option on Dante Cunningham. His $3 million player option might extend his free agency for another year, and chances are very high that he takes that option. Keep that in mind when making plans for the next season. Now, you might think that with this rather unimpressive roster, the Pelicans would have a decent amount of cap space. Sadly, however, that is not the case. Thanks to rather atrocious contracts for players like Solomon Hill and Omar Asik, the Pelicans have actually managed to go above the cap for the season, and the next year does not look much better. $10.5 million is not a lot of money if you want to make a splash in free agency, and that is not even factoring in a possible extension for Holiday or the player option for Cunningham. In short, to get the Pelicans back on track, you'll have to cut a lot of fat quickly. Now, last but not least, draft picks, and the pick situation in New Orleans is adequate but not too impressive. They managed to sneak a top 3 protection on their 2017 first rounder in the Cousins trade, meaning that the pick will technically only go to Sacramento if it falls outside of the top 3, which, even with a weak supporting cast, is more than likely. If against all odds the Pelicans keep their 2017 pick, the 2018 first rounder will then go to the Kings. Other than that, there is not much to talk about regarding draft picks in New Orleans. From 2018 onwards, the Pelicans own all of their picks. Now, before we go into the moves, here are, as usual, 3 key questions that need to be answered going into year 1 with the Pelicans. Number 1. Who gets the boot first? Basically, you have 2 full seasons to turn the Pelicans into something respectable. Then the contract of Cousins runs out and you should be able to present him with a competitive team to come back to. If you want to make that happen though, you need to get rid of some bad contracts. Omer Asik and Solomon Hill are the clear-cut prime targets here, with a combined value of over $20 million for at least each of the next 3 seasons. But Etuan Moore's 4-year $34 million contract might also be a bit much, and even the $3 million player option on Dante Cunningham is something that can be argued against. Question number 2. Is Jrue Holiday your point guard for the future? The former All-Star has certainly declined a bit, and 2K has penalized him with a below 80 rating. Still, Holiday is only 26 years old, and you might be able to sign him to an extension before he enters free agency, and you have to compete with other teams. The list of upcoming free agents that are at or above Holiday's level is rather short, and it includes guys like Steph Curry and Chris Paul, players that are very hard to get a hold of in 2K's free agency. You can certainly go all out for someone like Paul, as his elite playmaking skills would only suit the talent level of your frontcourt, but maybe you find that Holiday isn't that far off and decide to stick with him. And question number 3. How do you feel about your draft picks? Now, normally a team with 2 superstars like the Pelicans should have entered win now mode and should definitely not care too much about draft picks. In this case, however, the team is desperate for all the help it can get, and a young mid-first round pick might not be significantly worse than what the Pelicans have to offer right now. Acquiring such a pick might be a bit of a stretch, but it is not completely impossible. On the other hand, you could also go all out with your draft picks and turn them into trade assets. This might allow you to bring 1 or 2 good rotation players to New Orleans who can help the team right away. I would strongly recommend you familiarize yourself with the strength of your draft class a bit before making this decision. Now for the list of untradables, and if we're being honest, the Pelicans only have 2 players that are untradeable right now, and those are of course Davis and Cousins. For the sake of this video, I will also throw Holiday into the mix, but you might see that different. And now let's go into the moves to make, and we'll start with move number 1, trade Omer Asik and Solomon Hill. I think this is the most obvious move to make in New Orleans, and the contracts of Asik and Hill should be one of your main concerns in the first year. Asik, at 30 years old, will likely not develop any further. His contract, however, will. Not only will you pay him a guaranteed $32 million over the next 3 seasons, but he also has a ridiculous $12 million player option coming up for the 2019-2020 season, a season, by the way, in which he turns 34 years old. Now granted, Asik is a passable defender and rebounder, but so is Alexis Ajinça, and in contrast to Asik, he can also score in the paint, is 2 years younger and on a much cheaper deal. Giving playing time to both of them is not really possible anyway, with Cousins playing heavy minutes, so it only makes sense to ship one of them away, and Asik is the easy choice here. With Hill, the situation is somewhat similar to Asik. While he is a whole 5 years younger, his rating is about the same and his contract pays him even more per year. All of that money for a player whose main abilities are shooting and defending, both only slightly above average, and you can see why he's on my list. His age makes him a slightly more desirable target for other teams than Asik, although not by much. With this move, the Pelicans are able to get rid of their 2 worst contracts in the matter of just 1 season. Cap space is going to be important for the next 2 years if you want to surround Davis and Cousins with more star power. That sadly also means that we'll have to make a few drastic changes in New Orleans, and this move is one of them. Now, the real challenge is to find a trade partner, because unsurprisingly, nobody's all too keen on acquiring a low 70s player for that much money. For that reason, I can recommend throwing in one of your draft picks. This should not only increase the list of willing teams for this trade, but also make the entire thing a bit more realistic. I would also recommend trading both Hill and Asik separately, as this will drastically increase the number of trades available. Possible trade scenarios include, for example, straight-up trades of Asik for either Sean Long from Philadelphia or Raheem Christmas from Indiana. Both options are rather straightforward solutions. You'll lose Asik a bit below his value, but get rid of his salary in the process. The same straight-up trades also work for Hill, and for Hill and a second rounder, you can get a few expiring players from the Jazz. But keep in mind that Utah will have to re-sign Gordon Hayward this offseason, and loading the roster with a large long-term contract might be problematic in that regard. For Hill and 2 second-rounders, the Pacers are willing to part ways with Lavoy Allen, and depending on your choices with Asik, this might make sense if you now have a bit of a hold-down low. With $4 million on his contract and a $4 million team option coming up, Allen is not the cheapest player available, but he could be your backup power forward for the next 2 years. The first trade I made was then a bit underwhelming actually, Solomon Hill and a second rounder from Mike Miller from Denver. Miller will provide us with elite shooting for 1 year, although he probably won't see many minutes because of injury concerns and better alternatives. Then for Asik, if you're willing to part ways with your 2018 first rounder, maybe with a protection, you can find a lot more interesting offers. For example, Chris Dunn from Minnesota should be available, and even though Dunn is by many considered a draft bust, in this scenario he would get a second chance in New Orleans while Brandon Rush would expire and free up cap space. But even with an unprotected first round pick, this trade might be somewhat questionable from Minnesota's perspective, simply because they will soon have to pay their young stars, and acquiring Asik's contract will certainly not help in that endeavor. For more info on that, feel free to check out my Timberwolves video in this series. I eventually made the move with Philadelphia. For the price of Asik and a top 5 protected first rounder, I was able to acquire 21-year-old Timothy Luwawu. Luwawu is nothing special yet, but he is an incredibly athletic raw prospect with the potential to develop into a nice two-way wing player. He can do a little bit of everything, and while the Sixers do lose a young piece in their guard rotation, they acquire another draft pick, and apparently they just can't have enough of those. Asik's contract also ends before the Sixers star players Simmons and Embiid are eligible for contract extensions, so financially the team can take the move. If you want to, you can now change Luwawu to the small forward for a 1-point rating boost, but he works just as well as a long shooting guard. I would personally switch him to small forward, and that is because of move number 2. Because for move number 2, we'll trade E'Twaun Moore. Now, Moore is on a solid contract, but with the arrival of Luwawu, his minutes would be somewhat limited, or he might even move to the bench. For a player of his rating, $8.5 million per year is still a lot of money, and I think we can get that off the books rather easily. The list of offers for Moore is probably going to be very long, and as long as you acquire someone on an expiring deal, you're more than likely going to be fine. So I'll now skip the entire list of trade targets here and jump right to the move I made. I traded Moore and the second rounder for Wayne Ellington from Miami. This gives Miami a bit more long-term security at the shooting guard without taking on too much salary, and it provides us with a nice player who can either start or come off the bench behind Luwawu. If you want to save some money, then of course Ellington's team option should be declined after the season. Now, you could also trade Dante Cunningham now. This would of course bring your team chemistry down quite a bit, but one could argue that the sudden arrival of Demarcus Cousins demands sudden changes in New Orleans. The main reason for a move here would be Cunningham's player option for $3 million and the fact that after making Luwawu a small forward, Cunningham won't see much playing time behind Pondexter and Luwawu. This would leave the Pelicans a bit thin at the backup power forward though, and $3 million is also not enough money to really demand a trade here, but I just wanted to point out that you have the option. No matter how you decide here, let's move on with move number 3. And with move number 3, we want to, if possible, re-sign Jrue Holiday. Now, I would bring him back, and the main reasons for this are financial security and lack of alternatives. If Holiday is willing to sign an extension during the season, you should be able to save quite a bit of money. This might prove extremely useful as you enter the next few seasons and look for another quality star to bring to New Orleans. The other reason is the fact that if you let him walk, you'll need someone else to fill the role, and there are simply not that many players available that are better than Holiday. Sure, you can try to sign Steph Curry, Chris Paul or Kyle Lowry, but all of them will likely return to their own teams and you're left with nothing. Apart from those three, players like George Hill, Jeff Teague or Derrick Rose will become unrestricted free agents, and none of them are that much better than Holiday. If you add to that the fact that you can probably sign Holiday for several $1 million less than any of those players, he becomes a very attractive solution for your point guard problem. A solution that I personally would not pass up on. Just for comparison, you should be able to bring back Holiday for under $15 million a year, while Teague and Hill are both asking for roughly $25 million per year, and Rose usually wants something between 20 and 25. Now, I want to put a small question mark behind this move because you can of course always decide not to bring back Holiday and enter free agency with roughly $40 million in cap space, give or take 3 depending on what you did with Cunningham. This should, at least in theory, allow you to sign whoever you want, although in many cases you won't be able to beat the maximum offers of the players' previous teams. If you re-signed Holiday and made all the moves that I did, then you should still have about $20 to $25 million left to spend, which is more than enough to bring in players like Otto Porter, Danilo Gallinari, Tim Hardaway Jr. or Rudy Gay. If you don't like the options here, then you can of course just wait one more season and see who's available then. If you now decide that none of the players in the 2017 free agency class interest you all that much, then you don't need to rush all the trades the way I did, and you can safely delay moving either Hill or Asik to the next season. To quickly sum things up, the Pelicans need some drastic changes. The arrival of Demarcus Cousins catapulted the team into win-now mode, and sadly the roster in its current form does not reflect that. I know that the amount of trades in this video is a bit more than usual, but desperate times ask for desperate measures. And realistically, the Pelicans have to be desperate to build a strong team around Davis and Cousins, otherwise the latter might decide he won't come back. A lot of the contracts on the team prevent you from bringing in the pieces needed to turn the franchise around, so players like Hill, Moore and Cunningham will likely have to go, even though you normally might find some use for them. Now, while the Pelicans are my favorite team, they are definitely not the easiest choice in 2K17's MyGM or MyLeague mode. There is certainly a lot to do to get the team back on track, but nonetheless the team can be fun to play with once the major moves are made and you have a few nice pieces in place to surround your core. All of that can take a while, but in the end you might just get rewarded with an incredibly powerful team. And with that, let's wrap things up now. As always, let me know down below in the comments how you would handle the Pelicans in MyGM or MyLeague mode. Leave a thumbs up if you like this video, or if you want to support the channel, then feel free to subscribe. Thank you all for watching, and I'll see you next time. Cheers!